The war had raged for months. Earth, once a beacon of human civilization, was now a battlefield. Cities lay in ruins, skies were scorched, and the ground trembled under the weight of an alien invasion. The Zephyrins, towering beings of cold efficiency, had come with a singular purpose: to break humanity and claim the planet as their own. But humans were stubborn. They refused to surrender, refused to bow, and that infuriated the invaders. Their leaders, in desperation, devised a new strategy. They would take hostages, not soldiers, not politicians, children. The raids were swift. Schools, shelters, and hidden bunkers were stormed, and within hours, thousands of human children were taken. Not harmed, not tortured, just captured. The Zephyrins believed that holding them as leverage would force humanity into submission. Supreme Commander Voltaire stood aboard his flagship, gazing down at Earth's burning surface. His advisors murmured their concerns, but he silenced them with a wave of his hand. "They are sentimental creatures," he said. "They will beg for their young. They will kneel." His second-in-command, Drexus, hesitated before responding. "And if they don't, they will." Deep within an alien detention facility, the human children sat in cold, metallic cells. They were watched closely, studied like specimens, but they did not weep. They did not scream. A 12-year-old boy named Leo sat at the center of it all. His face was blank, his eyes sharp. He had seen the aliens before. They had taken his parents in the first wave. He hadn't cried then, and he wouldn't cry now. The Zephyrin guards watched him carefully. They expected fear, expected pleading. Instead, they saw something else. Calculation. "Why are they so quiet?" one of the guards muttered. No one had an answer. Leo scanned the room. The others were waiting for someone to take the lead. He inhaled slowly. He had read stories of war, of resistance, of men and women who refused to break. Now it was their turn. "They think we're weak," he whispered. "Let's show them otherwise." The older kids nodded. The younger ones, too afraid to speak, clung to each other but did not resist. The first test came that night. A Zephyrin soldier entered, towering over them with his 4 elongated limbs. "You will be fed," he stated. "You will remain compliant." Silence. The alien's mandibles twitched. "You will speak when addressed." Still silence. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the guard shifted uncomfortably. He expected defiance, expected rebellion, but not this. Not absolute stillness. Leo stared at him, his gaze unwavering. The alien exhaled sharply and left the room. The children did not speak until they were sure they were alone. Then Leo turned to them. "That's the first step." The plan had begun. 2 days passed, then 3. The Zephyrins continued their observations, but something was changing. The air in the facility felt different. It was no longer a prison holding helpless captives. It was a cage full of predators biding their time. One of the guards reported an unsettling experience to his commander. "They stare, but they do not speak," he said. "It is unnatural." Commander Drexus frowned. "They are children. They are something else." Drexus dismissed him, but that night he found himself thinking about it. Humans were unpredictable, but surely they could not be dangerous. The next morning, the guards noticed something strange. The children were no longer sitting in separate corners. They were always together, always moving as one. It was as if they had become a singular entity, thinking the same thoughts, breathing in the same rhythm. A new order came from Voltaire himself. "Test them." That night, they took one of the children, a boy younger than Leo, and separated him from the rest. They expected wailing. They expected the others to break. Leo only blinked. The boy didn't cry. "You do not care for your own?" a Zephyrin interrogator asked. Leo tilted his head. "We do. But do you know what happens when you push humans too far?" The interrogator frowned. "Enlighten me." Leo's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. "You find out why we survived this long." For the first time in his life, the Zephyrin felt something strange. Something he had never encountered before. Unease. The Zephyrins had faced many enemies in their conquest of the stars. Some had fought with brute force, others with strategy, but never had they encountered resistance like this. It was not physical, not yet. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The children refused to break. Walter watched the surveillance feeds, his frustration growing. He had expected tears, fear, obedience. Instead, he saw unwavering silence. The way they moved, the way they looked at their captors, it was deliberate. It was unsettling. Drexus stood beside him, arms folded. They do not behave like any species we have conquered. Walter exhaled sharply. They are waiting. For what? No answer. Down in the holding chambers, the tension between captors and captives was shifting. The Zephyrins were the ones growing restless now. They whispered among themselves, questioning why the humans were so calm, why they did not plead, did not fight, did not react the way they should. Leo sat among the children, listening. He could hear the uncertainty in the aliens' voices. That was the first crack. Fear did not come from force alone. It came from doubt, from the unknown. And the Zephyrins did not understand them. That was their weakness. The first real test came that evening. A Zephyrin officer entered the chamber, his gaze cold. "You will answer our questions," he said. Silence. The officer clicked his mandibles in irritation. He motioned toward a young girl and pulled her forward. "Speak," he commanded. The girl looked at Leo. He gave a barely perceptible nod. She turned back to the officer and smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to be seen. The officer hesitated. He had expected defiance, but not this. "What is your strategy?" he demanded. The girl kept smiling. "We don't need one." The officer released her and left the room faster than he intended. The whispers among the guards grew. This was not normal. This was not how prisoners behaved. Some began requesting reassignment. Others started avoiding eye contact with the children altogether. That night, the psychological war escalated. The humans began chanting softly. Not words, just a rhythmic hum that filled the chamber. It was low, steady, unnatural in its unity. The sound carried through the halls. It reached the Zephyrin barracks, the control rooms. It followed them in their sleep. One guard snapped, screaming at them to stop. The chanting ceased. The children stared. The guard left the room shaking. The next morning, that same guard was gone, relieved of duty. Walter's anger boiled. This was absurd. They were just children. "They are human," Drexus reminded him. Walter snarled. "They are prisoners." Drexus said nothing. He wasn't so sure anymore. That night, Leo made his first move. He let one of the younger children accidentally drop a food tray near a guard's foot. The child looked up with wide, innocent eyes and whispered, "You should leave." The guard nearly flinched. He didn't respond. He just walked away. The first real fracture had formed. The silence from the Zephyrin command was telling. The children were no longer just prisoners. They had become something else, an unknown variable. That made them dangerous. Walter paced in his war room, reviewing reports from his officers. Incidents were escalating. Guards refusing to enter the chambers alone. Security teams reporting a strange sense of unease. This was not how this was supposed to go. Drexus was the first to say it aloud. "They are turning our own fear against us." Walter scoffed but said nothing. Below, in the holding cells, Leo observed everything. The power had shifted. The Zephyrins still held the weapons, still controlled the facility, but they no longer controlled the room. The guards avoided confrontation now. Their orders had changed from interrogate to observe. They were losing their nerve. Leo waited until the time was right. That night, he spoke directly to one of the guards. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice calm. The alien stiffened but didn't respond. Leo continued. "You feel it, don't you? The wrongness. The way this place feels different than it should." The guard's mandibles twitched. "You took us because you thought we were weak," Leo said. "Now you're afraid. You don't understand why." The Zephyrin turned and walked away quickly. That was all Leo needed. The cracks were widening. In the control room, Drexus stared at the security feeds. The children were huddled together, whispering. Not in fear but in strategy. They weren't waiting for rescue. They were planning something. Walter clenched his jaw. This ends now. Orders were given. A new tactic: separate them, isolate the leaders, break them. But as the guards entered the chamber, the children didn't resist. They didn't struggle when they were pulled apart, didn't cry out when Leo was taken to another room. They only smiled. That unsettled the Zephyrins more than anything before. Leo sat alone in a cold interrogation chamber. Walter himself stood before him. "You think you're winning," the commander growled. Leo tilted his head. "Aren't we?" Walter's fists clenched. "You are prisoners. You have no weapons, no means of escape." Leo's eyes gleamed. "And yet you're afraid." Walter slammed a fist on the table. "Enough." Leo leaned forward. "You don't understand what you've done, do you?" Silence. "You didn't capture children," Leo said. "You captured humans." Walter had fought countless wars, crushed rebellions, and broken entire civilizations. Yet here he was, standing before a human child, feeling something he refused to name. Leo held his gaze unflinching. "You think power comes from control, from weapons, from fear?" He shook his head slightly. "That's why you'll lose." Walter exhaled sharply, forcing himself to regain control. "You are children." Leo's lips curled into a small smile. "And yet here you are." The commander stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet the facility had become. No cries, no sounds of struggle, just an overwhelming, unnatural stillness. He glanced at the surveillance feeds. The children in the other rooms weren't showing signs of distress. They weren't cowering. They were waiting. Drexus entered the room, his expression tense. "Something is wrong," he muttered. "The guards are uneasy." "They are children," Walter repeated through clenched teeth. Drexus didn't look convinced. "Then why does it feel like they're the ones keeping us here?" Walter turned back to Leo. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. It was maddening. "Enough of this," Walter snapped. He activated the command console on the wall. "Prepare the transport vessels. We're sending them back. Now." Drexus hesitated. "Surrender?" Walter didn't answer. An hour later, the detention cells were emptied. The children were escorted to waiting transports, Zephyrin soldiers avoiding their gazes. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. Leo walked at the front of the group, calm, composed. As he passed the command center, he glanced up at the observation deck where Walter stood. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Walter turned away. The ships departed. The war would continue, but the Zephyrins would never attempt this tactic again. They had learned something that would haunt them for the rest of their existence. You do not capture human children. You survive them,